The four-pump screamed it's thin. Relentless alarm. As Leo's oxygen sat stubbornly at 91% the bone marrow, consent packet lay open on my clipboard. Ink still wet, then his small hand slid over the signature line and pushed it back to me. His knuckles were paper pale, bruised from labs. His hospital wristband swallowed his wrist like a shackle. "No transplant," he said, voice steady enough to make the room feel wrong. His mother's sob caught in her throat like she'd inhaled glass. His dad stood behind her, jaw working, eyes fixed on the floor tiles as if they could offer a loophole. The monitor kept time with indifferent beeps. The room smelled of chlorhexidine and cold coffee. I'd explained the odds HLA match. Conditioning chemo, graft versus host until my mouth went dry. Leo didn't blink. "I'm tired," he added, and that was when I realized he was lying. Because this hadn't started here, this started 3 hours earlier, with a bill and a number that broke a family in half. 3 hours earlier. The whole way outside, the pediatric ed smelled like lemon cleaner trying and failing to erase the metallic bite of blood. A gurney rolled past with a squeak, rhythm that matched the cardiac monitors, and somewhere behind the double doors a child cried until the sound turned hoarse. I tightened my ponytail with hands that still held the sting of sanitizer and read the triage note again. 9-year-old male, Sifar neutropenici. Lethargic. When I pushed into room 12, Leo was sitting upright like he was waiting for a meeting, not an admission. His cheeks had that washed-out pallor you see in kids whose bodies have learned to live on fumes. And his eyelashes looked to long against skin that had gone almost translucent. The monitor showed sinus tachycardia in the 130s. His oxygen was fine then, a clean 98%, as if his lungs hadn't gotten the memo. His mother hovered at the bedside with a paper cup of water she wasn't offering, and his father stood near the wall holding a manila folder so tight the corners bent. "Hi, Leo," I said, keeping my voice low, deliberate. "I'm Dr. Avery. Any chest pain?" "Trouble breathing. Anything new besides the fever? I feel." "Foggy," he answered, and the word came out carefully chosen like he'd tested it first. His gaze flicked to my badge, then to the four-pole, then back to my eyes with a steadiness that didn't fit a kid his age. His mom tried to smile and failed, the expression collapsing into something fragile. "He just finished chemo last week," she added, as if saying it louder might make the fever less dangerous. Febrile neutropenia is a simple phrase that hides how quickly a child can fall apart. When your absolute roful count drops when the body's first resumption. Fever isn't a symptom, it's a warning flare. I ordered blood cultures from his port, a lactate, a CBC, semi-P and started broad-spectrum antibiotics, before the results could even come back. "Cefepim now," I told the nurse, and watched Leo track the syringe with the calm of someone who already knew the protocol. His father spoke for the first time without moving from the wall. "Is this normal?" "It's common," I said, and chose the word like a surgeon chooses where to cut. "But we treat it like an emergency every time." I heard the anos question inside his voice swill. "He died tonight." And pretended not to. Because sometimes the only thing holding parents upright is the illusion that we're not standing near the edge with them. While the antibiotic dripped in, I scanned the chart that followed Leo like a shadow. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, high-risk features, several rounds of induction. A partial response that never became the clean remission we wanted. The transplant consult had been scheduled for this week, donor search already underway, HLA typing pending on a cousin who lived 2 states away. The plan was clear on paper: conditioning chemo, wipe the marrow clean, replace it, pray. But paper plans don't account for the look on a mother's face when she's counting down the hours until a fever turns into sepsis. In the lull between tasks, I tried to meet Leo where he actually was. "They told me you're good at math," I said, letting it sound casual. His mouth twitched like the beginning of a smile. "I like patterns. "That explains why you're watching my orders like a resident," I replied, and his eyes brightened for half a second. Then his gaze slid past me to his parents, and the brightness shut off the way a monitor goes dark when the battery dies. The labs came back ugly in the familiar way. ANC effectively 0. Hemoglobin down, platelets low enough that a bruise could bloom into a problem. His blood pressure held, but his cap refill lagged just enough to make me uncomfortable. We admitted him to the pediatric oncology floor, a place where the air always feels a few degrees too cold and the bleeping never fully stops, where you can smell alcohol wipes and plastic tubing even before you see it. As we rolled upstairs, Leo's mother kept one hand on the rail of the gurney, knuckles white, like if she let go he'd drift away. Outside the room, I found the case manager waiting with a tablet and that practiced expression people wear when they've delivered bad news so often it's become part of their posture. She kept her voice quiet. "Transplant evaluation is going to be complicated," she said. "Clinically or administratively?" I asked, though I already knew. She angled the screen toward me. Pre-authorization requirements. Networks. Exclusions. A maze of pending and review. The family's insurance was employer-based. High deductible. And the transplant center hour, hospital partnered with, wasn't considered in-network for the plan they had. "They'll cover some," she said, "but the out-of-pocket max resets in 2 months. And there's the travel and lodging, and missed work," I finished, thinking of Leo's father's stiff shoulders and the cheap crease in his shirt collar that said he'd worn it too many days in a row. The case manager's eyes softened, but she didn't contradict me. No one ever wants to say out loud that in this country, the disease isn't always the most dangerous thing in the room. When I walked back in, Leo was awake, staring at the ceiling where the fluorescent lights hummed like insects. His parents had moved to the couch and chairs as if they were trying to take up less space. The manila folder sat on the side table now, open, spilling papers and estimate from a transplant coordinator. A printout of benefits, a scribbled list of phone numbers. Leo's father had written a single figure in the margin, heavy enough to tear the page, $487,000. Under it, smaller, not including complications. I shouldn't have looked, and he shouldn't have left it where it could be seen, but grief makes people sloppy. Leo followed my eyes and didn't flinch. That was the moment the whole room rearranged itself in my head, like a scan revealing a mass you can't unsee. Is that? I started, then stopped, because his mother's face had gone rigid with shame, and his father's throat bobbed like he was swallowing something too big. Leo, meanwhile, watched me the way a grown man watches a judge. "It's okay, os emails until okay, at y'all." He turned his head toward his parents without looking at them directly. "We can't," he added, and the words landed like a weight on the bed. His mother made a strangled sound. "Don't say that," she whispered, but her hands didn't reach for him. They stayed clenched in her lap, trapped between wanting to hold him and not knowing how to hold a future that expensive. I sat on the edge of the chair and lowered my voice until it felt like we were conspiring against the beeping machines. "Leo," I said, "the transplant is how we get you a chance." He nodded once, slow. "Chance," he repeated, tasting the word. Then he asked, almost politely, "How much does a chance cost?" And somewhere down the hall, a code bell rang sharp, urgent reminding me that bodies don't wait for insurance approvals. The first sign wasn't the numbers, it was the sound. At 17, Leo's monitor stopped beeping politely and started barking. That harsh, staccato alarm that turns a hallway into a battlefield. When I stepped into his room, the air felt colder than it should, like the Vuk had decided to practice medicine. Leo's lips were dry and slightly blue at the edges, and the sheet over his legs tiny waves from chills control. Tempat 40,2 se already moving. Heart rate 156. Pressure 84/46. His mother was out of the couch in a single motion. Hair stuck to her forehead, eyes wide like she'd been woken by a crash. His father stood frozen in the corner with the same folder clutched to his chest, except now it looked less like paperwork and more like armor. Leo stared at the ceiling again, but his gaze had gone unfocused, as if the room had drifted a few inches away from him. "Leo," I said, leaning in close. "Can you hear me?" He blinked once slow, heavy-handed when he answered. His voice was barely there. "I'm here." That word "here" landed wrong. Kids in septic shock don't announce their presence. They slip. I pressed her fingers to his wrist and felt a pulse that was fast and thin, like it was trying to outrun something chasing it. The smell of antiseptic mixed with warm sweat and the sour edge of fever, and I could hear the four-pump clicking as if it were counting down. "Sepsis bundle," I said, and the room snapped into motion. We drew repeat cultures, a venous blood gas, lactate, and started a bolus of fluids, wide-open saline rushing in with that clear, relentless sound. In plain terms, his immune system was essentially absent, and bacteria didn't need an invitation. They just needed time. His body was responding the way bodies do when they're losing heart racing, vessels dilating, pressure dropping, organs quietly asking for help. The nurse hung vancomycin alongside the cefepim, and I watched the line like I could will antibiotics to move faster. Leo's mother kept wiping his forehead with a washcloth that was already too warm. "This happens," she said, but she was saying it to herself, not to me. "This happens and then it gets better." "It gets better." His father finally stepped forward. "He was fine earlier," he said, voice cracking at the edges. He was talking about patterns. "Sepsis can turn fast," I answered, and hated how clinical it sounded, like a weather report. I looked at Leo's face again and tried not to show the calculation running behind my eyes. Hypertension, despite fluids. Altered mentation, rising fever. Neutropenic. This was a kid who could be in the ICU before sunrise. The lactate came back elevated, the kind of number that tells you the tissues are starving even if the oxygen saturation looks acceptable on the screen. His pressure nudged up with fluids, then sank again like a stubborn door that won't stay shut. I called the pediatric ICU and asked for a bed we didn't have time to politely request. When the raptum arrived, the bod zilt extra monitors. A portable ultrasound, the soft slap of gloves going on. The respiratory therapist hovered near the head of the bed, listening to Leo's breathing grow shallow and quick. The overhead lights made everyone look slightly washed out, like we were all part of the same exhausted photograph. "Another 20 milliliters per kilogram bolus," the fellow said, "and if he doesn't hold pressure." I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Pressors," she said. "Norepinephrine. Vasopressors are a kind of controlled violence medications. That squeeze the blood vessels tight enough to keep blood flowing to the brain and heart. They save lives, but they're not gentle. They also require a level of escalation that families feel in their bones, because once you're talking pressors, you're talking ICU lines, alarms that never stop, and bills that don't either." Leo's mother saw the norepinephrine syringe and went very still. "What is that?" "Medicine to support his blood pressure," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It helps his organs get what they need while we treat the infection." His father's eyes flicked to the manila folder on the table, then back to Leo. That tiny movement, barely a glance, was louder than any alarm. He didn't say the number, but it stood in the room with us anyway. Leo turned his head toward me, slow as if his neck weighed too much. "Don't," he whispered. I leaned closer. "Don't what?" "Don't." "Make them," he said, and his gaze slid, not to the medication, but to his parents. His mother's hands were trembling so badly she had to clasp them together to hide it. "Leo, honey," she pleaded, voice climbing into panic. "Stop. Stop talking like that." He swallowed, grimacing with the effort, and for a moment he looked exactly like a 9-year-old small, scared, trapped in a body that wouldn't cooperate. Then the mask came back, the calm that didn't belong to him. "It's okay," he breathed. I already did the math. I felt my stomach tighten. Kids say strange things when their sick fever can make anyone poetic, but Leo's words weren't delirium. They were intention. His pressure dropped again. The fellow looked at me, waiting. I could feel the whole room balancing on the edge of a decision that should have been simple. In medicine, when a child is crashing, you don't debate the ethics of saving them, you save them. But Leo wasn't just a body in shock. He was a mind making choices, with information he shouldn't have had to carry. "Start the norepinephrine," I said. His mother sobbed, in relief so sharp it sounded like pain. His father's face crumpled for half a second, an expression of guilt so raw he couldn't hold it. Then he forced it back into place. Because parents think they have to be strong, even when strength is just another costume. The nurse connected the line, and the monitor responded like a reluctant negotiation, pressure creeping up, heart rate easing down by a few beats, oxygen dipping then stabilizing. The respiratory therapist adjusted the nasal cannula, and Leo flinched at the cold air. I watched his eyes, waiting for that moment when a child looks at you like you've betrayed them. Instead, Leo's gaze stayed on his father. "Dad," he murmured, barely audible over the beeping. "Promise me." His father took a step forward, then stopped, as if crossing that distance would make the words real. "Promise you what?" he asked, voice thick. Leo's lips moved again, but the words got lost, swallowed by the alarm as his saturation dipped to 89%, and the nurse raised the oxygen. I leaned in, so close I could smell the fever on his skin. He whispered it into the space between us, and it hit me harder than any lab result. "Don't sign it. The ICU never truly sleeps, it just changes its pitch." The alarms were lower here, more calibrated, like the machines had learned that panic wastes oxygen. Leo lay under warmed blankets, a thin halo of vapor from the humidified high-flow cannula curling near his cheeks. The norepinephrine ran through, a pump that clicked with quiet authority, and his blood pressure finally held steady enough that my shoulders stopped bracing for bad news. His parents stood on opposite sides of the bed, not touching him, not touching each other. His mother's fingers hovered near his hair, as if afraid a caress might break the spell keeping him alive. His father kept staring at Leo's hands, small, bruised from attempts, like he was memorizing them for later. When Leo woke, he didn't cry. He turned his head toward me, eyes clearer than they had any right to be after septic shock, and said, "Did he sign?" "No," I answered. My voice came out softer than I intended. "Not yet," Leo exhaled, and the relief in that single breath made me feel sick. A 9-year-old shouldn't feel relief about refusing a chance to live. But I'd watched his father's face when Leo whispered, "Don't sign it," that split-second surrender before the man rebuilt his mask. Leo had seen it too. He was managing them the way adults manage each other, anticipating collapse, preventing it. I asked the nurse to give us 10 minutes. The curtain barely muffled the unit's sounds monitor beeps, a ventilator sighing in the next bay, the squeal of shoes on polished linoleum. I pulled the family into the small consult alcove where the light was too bright and the chairs were designed for compliance, not comfort. The manila folder came with them, edges frayed now, as if paperwork could bruise. "We need to talk about transplant," I began, and watched Leo's father flinch at the word. His mother spoke fast, like speed could outrun reality. "We're not refusing care. We want everything. We want—" Her voice snapped. "We just don't know how to do it." Leo sat between them on the chair, feet not reaching the floor, posture straight as a pencil. He looked at me the way residents look at attendings during rounds waiting for the plan. That was the part that terrified me most, how competent his fear had made him. "Leo," I said, "your parents are the ones who consent, but we also listen to you. We call it a censure agreement because it's your body. I don't assent," he replied immediately, not dramatic, not defiant. Just precisi. His father's eyes closed for a moment, as if he'd been slapped. Buddy, he whispered, and the word sounded like an apology. I forced myself to stay clinical, because the moment I let my heart lead, I'd either bulldoze them or break with them. Without a bone marrow transplant, your leukemia has a high chance of coming back aggressively, I said. With transplant, we have a real path to long-term remission. It's not guaranteed. There are risks: graft versus host disease, infection, organ damage, but it's the option that gives us the best shot. Leo nodded as if he'd already read the pamphlet twice. And it costs the house, he said. Silence settled, heavy and absolute. His mother's face crumpled, then hardened again, cheeks wet. His father stared at the floor, tiles like they had an answer hidden in the grout. We didn't tell him, his mother said, voice shaking with shame. You didn't have to, I replied, and my eyes flicked to the folder. Kids hear everything, especially the ones who are used to adults whispering. Leo's hand stayed folded in his lap. If you pay, you lose the house, he said to them, not to me. Then you can't take care of Emma. Emma, so there was a sibling, a little sister, maybe. A life Leo was already budgeting himself against. His father finally spoke, each word scraping out of him. We can sell it. We can morvi. People do that. Leo's mouth tightened. To where? His mother made a sound that was almost laughter, almost sobbing. Please, she begged Leo. Please don't do this. Don't decide this. But that was the point. He already had. I'm training the rule a mere life-saving treatment. Courts have backed that again and again, because society has decided that children don't get to die by logic. But this wasn't a teenager invoking a mature minor argument. This was a child who had learned that money can bleed a family as surely as disease. If they refused, I had options I hated. I could involve hospital legal. I could request an ethics consult. I could even trigger a court order compelling treatment if refusal constituted medical neglect. The system could force a transplant the way it forces a seatbelt hard, ugly, and for your own good. And after we saved Leo's life, his family might still lose everything that made that life worth returning to. I looked at Leo's parents and imagined them leaving the hospital with a child in remission and nowhere to take him. I imagined Emma sleeping on someone's couch. I imagined Leo waking up years later, alive, and realizing his life had been purchased with his sister's childhood. But I also imagined the other outcome, the quiet decline, the relapse that comes like a betrayal, the hospice conversations that smell like antiseptic and tears. And I felt that old, furious helplessness that medicine tries to cauterize early, the knowledge that I could manage presses and antibiotics. But not the country we practiced in. I'm going to be honest, I said, voice low. If you refuse a medically indicated life-saving treatment, the hospital may have to get ethics and legal involved. Not because we want to punish you, because we're obligated to protect Leo. Leo didn't react. His parents did. His mother's eyes widened, and his father's jaw clenched like he was holding back something primal. You'll take him from us? His mother asked. No, I said quickly. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the system doesn't know how to interpret your love when it looks like refusal. Leo's father leaned forward, elbows on knees, the folder dangling from one hand. Then tell me, he said, voice breaking open, if we say yes, who pays? Because the transplant center said in-network is a maybe. A maybe, he laughed once, a short, bitter sound. You can't buy a life on a maybe. I swallowed. There are things we haven't tried yet. Hospital financial assistance, a foundation grant, a transfer to a center with charity programs. Clinical trials sometimes cover parts of care. None of it is fast. None of it is guaranteed. But I can pull every string I have. Leo looked at me, finally letting emotion through the cracks. "And if you can't?" He asked. That was the dilemma in a single sentence. If I couldn't, would I still force this? A knock interrupted us. One of the ICU nurses leaned in. "I serious." "Dr. Avery." Transplant coordinator on line 2. I stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent light washing the color out of everything, and picked up the phone. "Dr. Avery," the coordinator said, breathless. "We have a 10/10 match. Donor is cleared. The bed opens tomorrow. We need signed consent by morning to start conditioning." I stared at the ICU doors, at the blur of staff moving behind glass, and felt time narrow into a single, merciless point. Tomorrow morning wasn't a deadline. It was a verdict. Morning came in pieces fluorescent light, bleeding under doors. The hiss of oxygen, the slap of gloves, the sour taste of vending machine coffee that had been reheated too many times. Leo's map, held with a whisper of norepinephrine. His fever finally bending under antibiotics, but his skin still looked too thin for the fight his body was waging. The transplant coordinators, deadline sat in my pocket like a stone, consent by 9 a.m. conditioning starts, today. At 6:12, the ethics consultant note hit my inbox. At 6:24, legal called me back. Is the family refusing a medically necessary, life-saving intervention? The attorney asked, voice calm in a way that made me want to yell. They're hesitating, I said. The child is refusing. The parents are paralyzed. Hesitation becomes refusal at a deadline, she replied. If the team believes refusal constitutes neglect, you can request emergency court intervention. Court. That word turns medicine into something else. It turns consent into compliance. I thanked her and hung up, staring at my own reflection in the dark IQ window-tired eyes, jaw clenched, badge crooked. I'd intubated kids, cracked chests, pushed epinephrine into veins smaller than straws. This felt harder, because the enemy had a name and it wasn't leukemia. I walked into Leo's room with the transplant forms and a second packet, the one titled Emergency. Motion. The air smelled of chlorhexidine and warm plastic from the high-flow cannula, tubing. His mother sat in the chair with her shoes off, socks mismatched, hands twisting a tissue into a rope. His father stood by the sink, scrubbing his hands like guilt could be washed away. Leo's eyes opened when I entered, sharp and awake. He looked at the papers and then at me, as if I'd brought a test. Is it today? He asked. Yes, I said. If we do it, we start conditioning today. It's chemo that wipes out your marrow so the new cells can take over, and then I'm in the hospital for. How long? His voice stayed even, but his fingers picked at the edge of the blanket like a tell, usually weeks. I answered, sometimes compinated ones. Weeks of bills. His mother made a small sound, like she'd been punched. Leo, please. He cut her off without raising his voice. I heard you on the phone, he said. About the mortgage. About the deductible resetting. About Emma's inhaler. His father's head snapped up. We didn't mean, I know, Leo said, and the kindness in it was worse than anger. That's why I'm fixing it. Something inside me went cold. This was not fatigue. This was a child taking responsibility for an economy. Leo, I said, keeping my voice low, you don't have to fix your parents. His gaze flicked to mine. Someone has two. I sat down so I wasn't towering over him. You're not choosing between your life and their comfort, I said. You're choosing between your life and a system that makes families pay to keep their kids alive. That system is wrong. But your life is not the payment. His eyes didn't waver. If I live and they lose the house, he said, what kind of living is that? His mother stood abruptly, chair scraping. We will sleep in the car, she said, voice shaking. We will move in with my sister. We will do anything. I don't care about the house. Leo looked at her for a long beat. You say that now, he replied. Because I'm here. Because I'm looking at you. But later you'll look at Emma and you'll hate me. I could never, she whispered. And she sounded like she was begging him to let her be his mother again. His father's hands curled into fists at his sides. I hate that you had to learn words like deductible, he said, voice rough. I hate that you're sitting there doing math, while we're supposed to protect you. Leo's expression softened just a fraction. Then protect Emma, he said. The monitor filled the silence with steady beeps. Outside the room, I could hear a ventilator sighing in another bay. A sound like the hospital breathing for someone who couldn't. I thought of the donor, a stranger who'd been typed. Cleared, ready to endure needles and pain so Leo could have marrow that worked. A perfect match. A door open for one day only. I picked up the transplant consent and placed it on the bedside tray. This is what we need if we proceed, I said. Then I set the emergency motion beside it, my throat tightening. And this is what the hospital can file if you refuse. Leo's eyes moved to the second packet. For the first time, his composure cracked. You'd make them, he asked, voice small. I don't want to, I said. But if you die from a treatable disease because of finances that will follow all of us forever, he stared at me, breathing shallowly through the cannula. So you'll save me, he whispered, and then they'll lose everything. I didn't have a clean answer. I had only probabilities and promises I wasn't sure I could keep. My phone buzzed again, transplant coordinator. I stepped into the hall to take it, my badge tapping against my chest with each breath. We can hold the bed until 9:30, she said. After that, we start conditioning another patient. Lie, boys. Hans did and feel steady. When I returned, Leo's father was holding a pen over the consent form, trembling. His mother had her hand over his wrist, not stopping him, anchoring him. Leo watched, the pen like it was a scalpel pointed at his family. Dad, Leo said quietly. Don't. His father squeezed his eyes shut, a tear tracking down his cheek before he could stop it. I'm sorry, he said, and I couldn't tell if he was apologizing to Leo or to the version of himself who believed love should be enough. Leo's face went still. He turned his head away, toward the window, as if he could bear to witness his own rescue. The monitor continued its indifferent rhythm, and the pen hovered a breath above paper. Wait, I said suddenly, the word leaving my mouth before I'd fully formed the thought. They all froze. I walked to the computer, pulled up the hospital's charity care criteria, the transplant center's billing codes, the clinical trial registry I'd bookmarked at 3 a.m. My fingers flew over the keyboard, fueled by desperation and caffeine. I called the financial counselor directly, put her on speaker, and said the words I hated. If this kid dies, it will be because of money. I need options right now. The counselor's voice came through tinny but firm. We can initiate an emergency hardship application. She said, we can flag the account for expedited review. It doesn't guarantee full coverage, but it can reduce out-of-pocket significantly. How fast? I demanded. If you get me income documentation today, she replied, I can get a preliminary determination within 24 hours. 24 hours we didn't have. I looked at Leo's father. Do you have your pay stubs? Tax return? Anything on your phone? He fumbled for it, hands shaking, and started scrolling like a man trying to find a lifeline in a digital ocean. His mother dug through the folder, papers fluttering, and a photo slipped out, a school picture of Leo smiling, hair fuller, cheeks rounder, a child unburdened by calculations. Leo watched them scramble, and the calm returned, this time edged with pain. You're still going to sign, he said. Not a question. His father's voice broke. Yes. Leo's eyes closed. A tear slid toward his ear and disappeared into his hairline. Okay, he whispered, and the surrender in that single word made my chest ache. Then promise me something. His father leaned close, forehead nearly touching Leo's. Anything, he said. Leo swallowed. "Promise me you won't let Emma think this was her fault," he said. "Promise me you'll still be." "You." His mother made a choked sound, pressing her face into Leo's shoulder as carefully as if he were glass. His father lifted the pen again, and this time it touched the paper. The signature was messy, rushed, almost illegible, like his hand refused to participate in the decision. When it was done, the transplant consent sat there, a completed form that looked too small to contain what it meant. I picked it up and felt its weight anyway. As I walked out to call the transplant team, I heard Leo's voice behind me, soft, steady, terrifyingly adult. "Dr. Avery," he said, "if I don't make it, you have to tell them I wasn't brave." I was just scared. Day 0, the transplant didn't look like a miracle. It looked like a bag of deep red cells, hanging from an 4-pole, drifting down tubing with the same indifferent gravity as saline. Leo lay in a positive pressure room behind glass, the kind that keeps germs out and loneliness in. He wore a surgical mask even in sleep. His mouth was cracked from mucositis, lips flaking despite the constant swabs. And the skin on his hands had gone dry and thin from chlorhexidine baths and chemo. When the marrow started infusing, his father flinched at the smell, first sweet, strange, like creamed corn and pennies. "That's normal," I told him, and hated that the word normal had to stretch this far to cover what we did to save a child. Leo's mother sat on the floor with her back against the wall because the chair had become unbearable. Every so often she pressed her palm to the glass as if she could transmit warmth through it. His little sister, Emma, wasn't allowed inside, just a video call on a tablet, her face pixelated and confused. "Why is Leo in a fish tank?" she asked, and her mother turned away fast, shoulders shaking without sound. Conditioning chemo had stripped Leo down to the essentials: the will to breathe, the will to speak, the will to keep watching his parents' faces for damage. On day +3, he spiked a fever that climbed to fast, and I watched the transplant team's posture change back straighter. Voices shorter, the way people move when they've seen this movie before. Blood cultures again, broad-spectrum antibiotics again. His blood pressure dipped like a warning. The nurse's hands stayed steady while mine hovered, ready to order presses again. On day +5, Leo stopped swallowing. The mucositis turned his throat into raw tissue, every sip a knife. He nodded when we offered morphine, but the nod was small, ashamed, like he was taking more than pain relief, like he was taking more from his parents' account. We started TPN, nutrition dripping into his vein because his body couldn't accept it the ordinary way anymore. The pump's soft whir became the lullaby of the room. His father asked me, "Is this the part where it goes wrong?" He didn't say a word between us, heavy as lead. "This is the part where it gets hard," I said. My throat tasted like old coffee. It can still go either way. At 2:41 on day +7, I got the call that snapped sleep into shreds. Leo was bleeding. His platelets were in the basement. His gums oozed, and he'd coughed into a tissue and watched red spread like ink. When I arrived, his mother was holding his hand through a glove port in the wall, tears sliding into her mask. Leo looked at the blood and then at me. "You're going to tell them it's my fault," he whispered, voice ruined by sores. "No," I said, leaning close so he could hear me over the high-flow hiss. "I'm going to tell them your body is fighting. And fighting looks messy." He shut his eyes, and for a moment he looked his age again, just a kid being carried by machines. The night blurred into transfusions and labs, and the steady choreography of people trying not to. Panic, platelets, packed RBCs, ice chips he couldn't swallow. Mouth care that felt like torture. We kept him out of the ICU by a thread and a constant presence. Nurses who moved like muscle memory, residents who spoke in clipped sentences. Me watching his numbers the way you watch a storm line on radar. On day +10, the transplant fellow walked into the unit holding Leo's CBC printout like it was a fragile artifact. "His ANC is 120, she said, and her voice did that thing trying to sound neutral while hope leaked through. Engraftment doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It shows up as tiny, stubborn numbers that refuse to be zero. Leo's immune system, the one borrowed from a stranger, was arriving cell by cell, taking its first tentative steps into a body that had been burned down to rebuild it. His father didn't understand the significance at first. Is 120 good? He asked. It's a start? I said, and felt my chest loosen in a way I hadn't allowed myself in weeks. By day plus 12, Leo's fever curve finally broke. The monitors quieted. The alarms that had owned our lives became occasional interruptions instead of a constant soundtrack. When we weaned his oxygen down, the room seemed to expand, as if the walls had been holding their breath too. His mother fell asleep sitting upright, head tilted against the glass, a dried tear track on her cheek like a scar. That afternoon, Leo opened his eyes and asked for water. It was a simple request, but it hit like a miracle. We gave him a teaspoon at first, then another, watching for pain, for coughing, for that betrayed expression. He swallowed, winced, and then barely smiled. His father leaned forward, voice cracking. "Hey, buddy!" Leo's gaze flicked to him, then to his mother, who woke like she'd been pulled from a deep ocean. He watched them both with that old habit of measuring their faces. Then he whispered, "Did you lose the house?" His mother's breath caught. "No," she said quickly. "Too quickly?" "Not yet. We're figuring it out." The truth was messier. Financial assistance had come back as provisionally approved, a phrase that sounded like mercy written by committee. A foundation had offered a grant that would cover travel and a portion of out-of-pocket costs. It wasn't salvation, but it was a bridge enough to keep the mortgage paid for a few months. While the appeals and paperwork crawled forward, I watched Leo absorb that. His eyes didn't brighten with relief the way mine did. Instead, his shoulders sank a fraction, as if the burden he'd carried had shifted but not disappeared. "I'm sorry," he rasped, and the words scraped out of a throat still healing. I tried to. "Make it easier." His father shook his head hard. "Don't you dare," he said, voice thick. "Don't you ever think you had to make our lives easier by making yours shorter." Leo blinked, and a single tear slid toward the corner of his eye. "I wasn't brave," he whispered, looking past them toward me, remembering his last request. "I was just scared." I held his gaze and nodded once, slow, letting him see I'd heard him. "Being scared and staying here anyway," I said, "is what bravery looks like from the outside." After they settled Mother's hand on his hair, Father's forehead pressed to his, there was a moment of quiet so complete I could hear the faint click of the four-pump and the soft whoosh of the room's ventilation. The crisis had passed, but it left its shape behind in the bruises on Leo's arms, in the tremor in his mother's hands, in the way his father kept glancing at the door, as if someone might come in and take the hope back. I stepped out into the hallway, the fluorescent light flattening everything, and realized my own hands were shaking. Not from adrenaline this time, something slower, deeper. A child had tried to die to keep his family housed, and we had called it medicine. The discharged Leo rang the unit's little brass bell with a wrist that still wore bruises like faded fingerprints. The sound didn't cut through the hospital the way people pretend it does. It was thin, almost shy, but his mother covered her mouth anyway, and his father blinked hard, staring at the floor as if the tiles might crack open and swallow whatever he was feeling. Behind the glass, the positive pressure room exhaled its filtered air, and for the first time in weeks, I smelled something other than antiseptic and warmed plastic tubing. He walked out slower than the other kids. A surgical mask covering half his face, and a knit cap pulled down over scalp stubble that couldn't decide if it wanted to grow back. A discharge summary sat in my hands, thick with diagnoses and codes. All. Neutropenic sepsis, mucositis, thrombocytopenia, tepeni words of Petraf bleeding. Leo's little sister, Emma, waited at the end of the corridor holding a hand-drawn sign that said "Welcome home" with letters, that leaned like they were running. Leo stopped before he reached her. He watched Emma's sneakers shuffle on the waxed floor, watched his mother's hand hover near his shoulder, watched his father's jaw clench and release like a metronome. Then he crouched careful, deliberate, and opened his arms, and Emma collided with him like a small, unstoppable farcy. He made a sound into her hair that might have been a laugh, might have been a sob, and his mother turned her face away, pretending to read the discharge instructions. Outside, winter air slapped my cheeks and tasted like car exhaust and freedom. Leo stood on the curb, blinking at daylight as if it were too bright to trust. And his father fumbled with the car seat booster he'd bought in a panic weeks ago and never had the heart to install. Leo watched him struggle with the straps, then reached out with his thin fingers and helped, the gesture so practical it hurt. When the buckle clicked, his father's shoulders sagged, relief disguised as a simple breath. The bill 2 days later. My hospital phone rang while I was washing my hands, the water hot enough to sting. The caller ID showed patient financial services, and my stomach tightened before I even answered. Because I'd learned which alarms mattered most. The representative spoke in a bright, trained voice about remaining responsibility, pending appeals, and out-of-network carve-outs, as if we were discussing a delayed flight. I could picture Leo's father opening an explanation of benefits at the kitchen table, the paper trembling in hands that had held their child through fevers. I imagined the numbers printed in crisp black ink, a kind of violence that never left bruises. The foundations had helped. The hardship application had cut the out-of-pocket. It issue wasn't clean, and it still wasn't fair, and the phrase provisionally approved still sounded like a promise made of smoke. That night I drove home with the radio off, listening to my tires hiss over wet pavement. I kept replaying Leo's question, how much does a chance cost? And realized that the answer changes depending on who's doing the paying. In the ICU, the price is blood pressure and lactate and how many milliliters per kilogram you can push before the lungs drown. Outside the ICU, the price is a mortgage, a marriage, and a child learning to translate love into arithmetic. A week after discharge, I got a message through the patient portal. It was short, typed by Leo's mother, full of gratitude that made my throat close. At the bottom she added one line that didn't belong in a thank you note. Leo keeps asking if you're mad at him for what he said. I stared at the screen, the blue light washing my hands pale. The truth was complicated. I wasn't mad at Leo. I was mad at the adult world that had backed him into a corner and told him it was maturity. What changed in med school? We learn autonomy like it's a clean principle. Patients make choices. We respect them. We also learn pediatrics like it's a clean exception. Children can't carry life and death decisions because they don't have the capacity. Leo lived in the muddy space between too lucid to dismiss and too young to let die. And I used every tool I had: ethics, legal language, hospital policy to push his family toward a signature. I can defend the decision in a conference room with bullet points and outcome statistics. But at 3 a.m., alone, it feels like a different kind of wound. I keep thinking about the moment he whispered, "Don't sign it," and how his father's face did that brief collapse into truth before he rebuilt himself. Medicine talks about moral injury like it's a clinician esse private ashi. But Leo showed me another version, a child injured by the morality of adults who loved him and still couldn't protect him from the economy. The monitors didn't measure that. There wasn't a lab value for kid trying to die to keep his sister housed. On my next overnight shift, I admitted a teenager with DKA and watched her mom argue with registration about coverage while her daughter's breath smelled like acetone. In another room, a man with chest pain asked if the EKG was expensive, his hand pressed to his sternum like he could hold the cost in place. I heard Leo's steady voice behind every question, that premature calm that isn't bravery, it's resignation dressed up as logic. A month later, Leo came back for follow-up, smaller than I remembered and stronger than I expected. His counts were improving, his skin less translucent, his gait still cautious like his body didn't trust the ground yet. He handed me a folded sheet of notebook paper covered in patterns repeating triangles, spirals, little grids that tightened and loosened like breathing. In the corner he'd written, in careful block letters, "I'm sorry I made it hard." I didn't tell him he shouldn't apologize, because he already knew that answer, and it hadn't helped. I told him what I wished someone had told him earlier. It was never your job to be the adult. He watched my mouth, then nodded once, not fully convinced, and slipped his hand into his mother's without looking at her. A quiet truce between who he'd been forced to become and who he still was. When I think of Leo now, I don't picture the septic alarms or the consent deadline. I picture him crouching in the hallway, arms open, letting Emma crash into him, choosing connection over calculation for one unscripted second. That's what stayed with me, the reminder that the hospital is where masks fall. And sometimes the most human thing a person can do is stop doing the math.